So today we're going to talk about Jung, and I find that tremendously entertaining. I'm not sure I've ever read anyone as intelligent as Jung, except maybe Nietzsche. It's funny, he's accused of many things, such as starting a new religion, by some rather unscrupulous biographers. But what he did was actually far more radical than anything he's ever been accused of. One other thing I should tell you, too, is Jung has often been accused of anti-Semitism, but one of the things that came to light last year was that he was working as an agent for the American government during World War II and frequently set updates on Hitler's psychological condition to the highest levels of the American government. He never told anybody about that. So you know, that's a little hard on old accusations of anti-Semitism, I think, which I've never thought held any merit anyways. So, Jung. He was a strange guy in many ways. Extraordinarily imaginative. He could get lost in daydreams and was a tremendously powerful visualizer. And a lot of what he discovered was a consequence of engaging in long-term, elaborated fantasies. And in these fantasies, he could have conversations with figures of his imagination and communicate with them. I had a client at one point who was a very prolific dreamer, and she could talk to her characters in her dreams and ask them what they meant symbolically, and they would tell her. That was really something. I've only seen one person who was capable of doing that. I don't know if it helped her that much in the final analysis, but she could do it. But Jung was very, very interested in the depths of the human imagination. Now, his body of work can be viewed as an amalgam of many things, but he had deep knowledge of Latin and Greek, and he'd studied alchemical manuscripts for many, many years as an older man. So he was very interested in the emergence of the idea of science from what he considered the collective imagination. But in many ways, his primary modern intellectual influences, I would say, were Nietzsche and Freud. And Jung really set out, somewhat like Piaget, to address the gap between religion and science. But he did it for different reasons than Piaget. Jung took Nietzsche's comments about the death of God very seriously. And one of the things Nietzsche predicted at the end of the 19th century was that there were going to be two major consequences of the collapse of formal religious belief. He believed that that would lead people to a morally relativistic condition that would prove psychologically intolerable. Because if you adopt a morally relativist position and you take it to its final conclusion, then everything is of equal value, and there's no gradient between things. There's no better and there's no worse. And in the final analysis, you might say, well, there's no good and there's no evil. And the problem with that is you can't actually orient yourself in a world that has those properties, because in order to act, as we've already talked about with regards to the cybernetic models, you have to be aiming at something that's better than what you have now, or there's no reason to expend the energy. And so you need the gradient, you need a value differentiation in order to act. And Nietzsche's analysis was predicated on the idea that if the value hierarchy collapsed, well, not only would people not be motivated to do anything anymore, but they would also be extraordinarily confused and depressed, because the value would go out of their life. And the consequence of that would be that they would become somewhat nihilistic, or maybe absolutely nihilistic, or that they would turn to rigid ideological systems as a replacement. Now, what Nietzsche offered as an alternative to that was that human beings could create their own values. And so his idea was that the superman, the overman, depending on how you look at it, would be the person who was capable of transcending the valueless universe that the decline of religion had left with us, and creating their own values as a conscious act. The problem with that is that it isn't obvious that you can create your own values as a conscious act, because it's not obvious that values are consciously created. And I think this is why the psychoanalysts had so much to add to the philosophical debate, at least the philosophical debate that developed to the point of Nietzsche's observations. When Freud entered the scene, the idea of the unconscious was in the air, but Freud formalized it to a much greater degree than anyone else had. And Freud's theory really is deeply biological. You know, it's biological, it's social as well, but his proposition, the proposition that there's an id, is fundamentally the proposition that you're not necessarily, your consciousness, for sure, is not the master in its own house. Now, I think part of the reason that people like to go after Freud, there's a variety of reasons, but one of them is that modern people basically accept radical Freudian presuppositions more or less as givens now. You know, and so if you're a brilliant thinker and your thought permeates a society to the point where your most radical propositions are accepted by everyone, all that's really left are your errors. And so it's easy to concentrate on Freud's errors because we've already digested everything he had to say that was particularly profound. I mean, I don't imagine, perhaps I'm wrong, but I don't imagine that there's anyone in this room to whom the news that many of your motivations aren't conscious comes as a surprise. I mean, even psychologists have admitted that in the last 20 years, you know. I mean, they talk about the cognitive unconscious, which I think is a real sleight of hand maneuver to stop them from having to credit Freud with his discoveries. And I also think that Freud's notion of the unconscious is far more sophisticated than the cognitive scientists' notion, because Freud viewed the unconscious as a place that was basically populated by fragmented personalities, not cognitive schemes of one form or another, and not processes, but things that were like living beings. And you know, you think, well, are there living beings in your unconscious? And the answer to that is, well, are you alive or not? And you're alive, so you're composed of living subcomponents, and they're not machines, or at least not in any way that we understand machines. They're fragmentary subpersonalities, and each of them have their own worldview and rationalizations and emotional structure and goals. And so that's why when you get hungry, you see the world through the eyes of a hungry person, and you think thoughts about food, and your emotional reactions depend on whether food is available or whether it isn't, and maybe whether or not the food you want is available and whether it isn't. And you know, that's nature, so to speak, imposing its necessities on you as a living being. And for Freud, that was the id. And Freud thought of the id really as something that was primordial and primitive. And that's one of the things that really separated him from Jung. And I think Jung is much more accurate from the perspective of evolutionary psychology. In fact, I think he's radically underestimated as a thinker whose thought was unbelievably deeply grounded in biology. And like, Jung was a remarkable person because his notion of history and the relationship between history and the human psyche covered spans of time that were really, until modern historians and evolutionary psychologists started to talk about deep time and the fact that, you know, the entire 4 billion year history of the world is in some sense relevant to us as beings, or at least the 3.5 billion year history that there's been life on the planet. Ancient history for European philosophers was like 500 to 2,000 years ago. And Jung thought way past that, way back farther than that, and started to take into serious account the fact that the origins of our psyche, the ground of our psyche, is deeply biological, and that it's an emergent property. So for Freud's idea of the unconscious is somewhat difficult to understand because there's sort of two elements to it. There's the id, which is the source of primordial motivation. And Freud concentrated mostly on aggression and sexuality. And the reason he concentrated on those two, although he concentrated on what he called the death instinct later in his life, the reason he concentrated on those two primarily wasn't because he regarded them necessarily as the most compelling of motivations, but he regarded those motivations as the ones that were most difficult for most people to integrate successfully into the social world. So he thought that they were most likely to be repressed and therefore underdeveloped and immature. And I think that's a reasonable proposition. I think that modern people would have to add eating to that, because since the time of Freud, we've gone, I would say, from a high proportion of sexually related pathologies to a very, very high proportion of eating related pathologies, but that's in some sense beside the point. So that's one part of the Freudian unconscious, sort of an implicit unconscious. And then the other part of the Freudian unconscious is those things that have happened to you that you've repressed because you don't like what they imply. And you know, those are very different kinds of unconscious, because one of them is dependent on your experience and the other isn't. And you could think of Jung actually as a deep archaeologist of the id. And Freud thought about the id in sort of primordial terms. So his angry id would be, you know, like a beast that's out of control. But Jung recognized that the unconscious was far more sophisticated in many ways than the conscious parts of your being, and that it guided your adaptation in ways that you didn't understand, and that the ways in which it guided your adaptation and structured your understanding were universal, hence biological, and far more sophisticated than a somewhat primordial notion of biological drive might indicate. So one of the things that you might consider, for example, is that from the Jungian perspective, a lot of the forces that ancient people considered deities were personified representations of instinctual systems. So here's a way of thinking about it, and this is a way of thinking about the collective unconscious, which is Jung's, in some sense, Jung's replacement term for the Freudian id. So Mars, for example, is the god of war, Roman god of war. And you might say, well, what does it mean for there to be a god of war? And the answer, or Venus is the god of love, actually of sexual attraction more particularly. Or of sexual possession, which is even a better way of thinking about it. And you say, well, why would people conceptualize of those phenomena as gods? The Greeks said, for example, that human beings were the playthings of the gods. No, that was Shakespeare. I'm sorry, that was Shakespeare who said that. Well, here's one way of thinking about it. What's older, you or aggression? And the answer to that is, well, you're 23. And the system that mediates biological aggression in mammals and their progenitors is tens of millions of years old. And if you think you control it, rather than the other way around, you're deluded about your central nature. Part of it is that you don't control it at all. What happens is that you never go anywhere where you need to use it. And so one of the things that happens to soldiers in wartime, for example, is they go somewhere where they could use it, and out it comes, and the consequence of its emergence is so traumatic that they develop post-traumatic stress disorder, because they observe themselves doing things that are hyper-aggressive that they could have never imagined that someone like them could have manifested. And then you think, well, what about Venus as a goddess? Well, if you fall in love with someone, who is that a choice? It doesn't look like a choice. I mean, if it's a choice, it's often an incredibly self-destructive and idiotic choice, and it's often one that ruins people's entire lives. It's more like a state of possession. And then you might say, well, possession by what? Well, it's a dynamic living system. And it's also immortal in some sense, which is another reason why conceptualizing it as a deity makes sense. I mean, the phenomena of love, which is the manifestation of a complex biological system, will be along will be around long after you're gone and was there long before you showed up. And when it manifests itself, so to speak, within you, you're possessed by it. And you do its bidding. And you may do its bidding despite what you most deeply want. You know, modern people tend to think that the conscious parts of their brain, or let's say the more newly evolved elements of their brain, because we don't actually know what the relationship is between consciousness and the newly developed parts of the brain. The assumption is often made that the reason we're conscious is because we've developed a very spectacular cortical cap, but consciousness appears to be far older than that. So that's an erroneous assumption. But we do tend to believe that the most complex and sophisticated parts of our brain are the cortical cap, the complex cortical cap that's quite enlarged in human beings relative to our body size, because it's the newest systems, and it's also part of the systems that allow us to do such things as communicate with language and think in abstract symbols. But there's a different way of thinking about this from a biological perspective, and that is, what makes you think the newest system is the most sophisticated one? Why don't you assume that the oldest system is the most sophisticated one? Because it's been around for, well, for example, the mechanism in your neurological, the mechanism that underlies your conception of your relationship to the dominance hierarchy, for example, is at least 300 million years old. And the reason it's lasted 300 million years is because it knows what it's doing. It's far older than the parts of your brain that make you conscious in the specifically human way. And it's so deeply embedded in your brain in some sense that you have almost no voluntary control over it. And that's why, for example, one of the things that happens to people who are depressed is that the system that reports their dominance status reports that they're low. Now, sometimes that's true because they're not depressed. They just have an awful life and they're actually at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy, and that's not the same as being depressed. But sometimes it malfunctions, so someone who's competent and well situated in life and who appears to have everything that a person could possibly desire in order to have a decent and meaningful and positive life are still catastrophically depressed. And what seems to happen in those circumstances is that the dominance counter, for one reason or another, is acting as if they're incredibly low status when they're in fact not. And I think that's a good definition of clinical depression. I also think that part of the reason that there's mixed results with regards to antidepressant trials is because antidepressants don't help you if you're at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy. Well, how could they? You're not depressed. You just have a terrible life. That is not the same thing. And they need to be carefully distinguished, because if you're unemployed and you're facing the loss of your home and maybe your partner's going to leave you and your children hate you, an antidepressant is very unlikely to fix that. Now, to the degree that misbehavior on your part caused by impulsivity and increased aggression and decreased mood because of your reaction to that circumstances is making it worse, then the antidepressant might help you. And maybe the antidepressant will help you regain enough cognitive control so that you can plan your way out of the situation. But as a medication in and of itself, there's no possible way it can lift you out of those often catastrophically complex and disintegrating circumstances. Whereas if your life is fine but you feel terrible, well, it's much more likely that an antidepressant can help with that, because in some sense what it's going to do is to readjust your dominance, the reporting of your dominance counter, so to speak, to the level that's appropriate for your level of competence, which is really what you want. You know, people say you should have high self-esteem. I would say idiots say that you should have high self-esteem. It's an unbelievably corrupt construct in many ways, because it's actually very, very highly correlated with baseline levels of neuroticism, negatively, which is a fundamental personality trait, and baseline levels of extroversion. So someone with low self-esteem is generally someone who's introverted and has high levels of negative emotion. It's a trait-like phenomena. It isn't clear at all that calling that low self-esteem has any utility whatsoever, But then you also might ask yourself, well, how much self-esteem should you have? Well, and that's a very complex question, because you can clearly have way too much. That's what would make you a narcissist. So I would say your self-esteem should be roughly equivalent to the esteem in which you're held by members of your society, you know, your family and your society, because they're judging you, at least in part, on your competence. And you shouldn't think that you're more competent than you are, and you shouldn't think that you're less competent than you are. You should think that you're as competent as you are. And sometimes that means you're not competent at all because you don't know what you're doing, and sometimes it means that you're quite competent. Now, I think it's complicated by the fact that you should also regard yourself not only as who you are, but as who you could be. You know, and so if you're of lowly dominant status, which, for example, in some sense you guys are because you're young and, you know, you're starting your lives, the fact that there's a lot of potential that you still are able to manifest should tilt the self-assessment balance in your favor to a fair degree. So, anyways, Jung was very interested in the depths of the psyche, and for him the unconscious wasn't a repository of repressed experiences, and it wasn't a repository of underdeveloped and irritated biological systems. It was instead the underlying structure of consciousness itself. So Jung believed that human experience, as it's consciously manifested, was structured by underlying patterns of behavior that were specific and unique to humankind, although shared to some degree with other animals. And then on top of that, a realm of imagistic and symbolic representation that in part was a consequence of representation of those underlying behaviors. So here's a way of thinking about it. We act in a human way, whatever that means. And we've been acting in a human way for as long as there's been human beings, and we've been acting in a mammalian way for as long as there's been mammals. Now, human beings are quite peculiar creatures because not only do we act, we also watch ourselves act, and we represent those actions. And Jung believed that as a consequence of us manifesting a specific set of typically human behaviors over hundreds of thousands or perhaps millions of years, we also evolved a cognitive apparatus that was capable of representing those patterns of behavior. And that cognitive apparatus expressed the representations of those fundamental patterns of behavior in imagistic and symbolic form. And the basic imagistic and symbolic form is something like drama. Now, why would that be? Well, it's obvious in some sense. What is drama? Drama is the representation, the abstract representation of patterns of behavior. That's what you do when you go to a movie. You watch people manifest their characteristic behaviors. And then you might note that there's characteristic, quasi-unique patterns of behavior that are portrayed in drama. So, for example, there's the bad guy, and he wears a black hat in a cowboy movie. And whenever you go to a movie, it's pretty clear to you right away who the good guys are and the bad guys are, and you accept the distinction between good and bad guys as an a priori acceptable distinction. So Jung would say, well, that's the action of an archetype. What underlies that is the archetypal story of the hostile brothers. And the hostile brothers, for example, are Cain and Abel, which is the story of Cain and Abel in Genesis, by the way, is really the second story that's in that origin myth, and it's the first story about real human beings, right? Because Adam and Eve, so to speak, were created by God, whereas Cain and Abel were born, the first brothers. Well, what happened? Well, one of them became insanely jealous of the other and murdered him. So that's a pretty harsh story when you think that, you know, the monotheistic religions of the West, roughly speaking, put as one of their foundational stories the idea that there's a twin pair of forces operating in the human psyche that can be conceptualized as brothers who are murderously opposed to one another. It's like, that's part of the reason why that story hasn't disappeared. It's so powerful, it's so shocking, it's so powerful that it can't disappear. And the reason for that is that it's true, in a sense. It's true that a reasonable drama, not all of them obviously, but a large proportion of them, has a bad guy and a good guy. And then you might say, well, what would the archetypes be? Well, the archetypes would be the ultimate good guy and the ultimate bad guy. And there's representations of the ultimate good guy and the ultimate bad guy. Jung was very influenced by Christianity, and part of the reason for that is that he grew up in a state that was Protestant, primarily Christian, and a number of his immediate ancestors were pastors. So he grew up in an atmosphere that was pretty saturated by religious ideas. And so a lot of his thinking was heavily influenced by Christianity. So one of the things he pointed out was that just like Cain and Abel, who are archetypes in a sense, they're archetypes of they're the Old Testament version of archetypes of the hostile brothers, Christ and Satan are archetypes. And the reason they're archetypes is because virtually by definition, the satanic symbol, so to speak, is a representation, a symbolic representation of everything that's terrible about human beings. It's an archetype. You can't imagine anything worse than that, so it's like a limit case. And then when you go to a movie and you see bad guys, you can think of them as partial approximations of the archetype. Or you can think about them as the archetype differentiated in a manner that makes exposure to the archetype fresh and interesting. Because you just don't want to go and see the same old bad guy over and over and over. You want to explore the entire complex behavioral and representational system of the archetype of evil in every conceivable situation. And in the same way, you want to explore the archetype of good. And the reason you want to do that, in principle, depending on your motivations, is to control the influence of the factors that underlie the negative archetype in your life, and to manifest the factors that underlie the positive archetype. And that's why you hope for the good guy. It's also why, generally speaking, in a drama, you embody the good guy while you're watching the movie. So I can give you an example of this. So one of the things I learned to do with my son when I took him to movies, because when he was a little guy, I took him to fairly intense movies, and sometimes too intense, but one of the things I taught him when he was afraid was keep your eye on the hero. Not don't be afraid or it's not real. It's like, you could easily make a case that a movie is more real than normal life. Why would you watch it otherwise? What a movie is normal life stripped of everything that's trivial. So if you strip a representation of everything that's trivial, what makes you think that isn't more real? So is fiction more real than life? Well, is abstraction more real than reality? It certainly is in many cases. I mean, there are people who believe, for example, that mathematical representations are the most real of phenomena. They certainly, if you're a very powerful mathematician, you certainly become, or if your society is very powerful mathematically, it certainly gives you a tremendous amount of control over your environment. So the idea that abstractions aren't real that's a silly idea. And the idea that fiction isn't real, all that indicates is a confusion about what constitutes real. A movie is a representation of characteristic behavioral patterns extending across time. And it can be a more or less useful and accurate distillation of those representations. And generally what we assume is that the greater the fictional representation, because we make a distinction between great fictional representations and second-rate fictional representations. So Shakespeare, for example, is a master at exploring the contours of the archetype in a complex, realistic, and useful manner. Now, Jung also believed that there were these patterns of behavior, and they would constitute the typical behavioral patterns of human beings. And then we evolved a system of representations of those patterns, and that would enable us to understand the patterns in a way that other animals can't, because we're self-conscious, right? So what does it mean to be self-conscious? It doesn't just mean that you know that you exist as a separate entity. Like, it's not just a state of conscious awareness. It's a knowledge condition. You have at your fingertips a very large representational storehouse of abstract knowledge about what human beings are like. And that's developed over tens of thousands of years, right? It's a collective activity. The generation of all these stories we tell about each other. I mean, we have ancient stories. The oldest stories we have, by the way, are Mesopotamian stories, as far as I know. And the oldest Mesopotamian story, or one of the oldest Mesopotamian stories we have, is a hero story where the god, Marduk, fights a great dragon and cuts her into pieces and makes the world. And you might think, well, what do you, Mesopotamians, you know, what do you mean the world's created out of the pieces of a great dragon? Well, it's a Piagetian idea with a bit of narrative complexity added to it. It's like, well, how do you create the world? Well, you confront the unknown and you transform it into the known, or you confront unexplored territory and you transform it into explored territory. And then you might say, well, what exactly is the unknown, or what exactly is unexplored territory? And a scientist would say, well, you know, if you walk out in a field that you've never been in before, there's soil and material elements, and that's what's really there. But that isn't exactly what's really there. It depends on your time frame. So one of the things I could say about that, for example, is that if you wander outside the boundaries of your knowledge, if you wandered outside the boundaries of your territory when you were an animal, or when you were a more archaic human being, the probability that you were going to run into something that was going to tear you apart and eat you was extremely high. And so then I could say, well, the fundamental nature of the unknown is that which tears you apart and eats you. And you might think, well, is that, what sort of reality is that? And I would say, you know how you hear evolutionary psychologists talk sometimes about the fact that we evolved on the African veldt and now our nervous systems are sort of adapted for that primordial environment and not really for the modern environment, and so there's a mismatch between us and the modern world. It's like, I think that's an absolutely reprehensible theory, partly because we didn't just evolve on the veldt. We've been evolving for a very long time. We spent a lot more time in trees, for example, than we did on the veldt, and while we were spending time in trees, a lot of us were eaten by snakes, for example. And so that's another reason why the unknown itself is represented as this terrible, predatory, reptilian beast. And then the human being is represented as that which, or the conscious element of the human being, which was represented by the Mesopotamians as a god, the highest god, actually, in the hierarchy of gods, which was a brilliant Mesopotamian realization, because the Mesopotamians basically concluded in their drama, their religious drama, that the highest faculty of the human being was the capacity to consciously attend to the unknown and to make something new out of it. Well, that's a Piagetian idea, right? That's exactly what Piaget was talking about when he talked about the necessity of comprehending knowledge as a process rather than as a collection of facts. It's a process. What's the process? Confront what you don't understand. Boldly go where no one has ever gone, right? I mean, Star Trek, that's where systematizing minds get their mythology. You know, it's rife with mythology, and its initial statement is a mythological statement, and it's a statement of the eternal explorer. And that's an archetypal idea. And, you know, you might say, well, are you still threatened by those terrible things that threatened your ancestors on the veldt? And normally people would say, well, no, because there are no lions. But that's because they don't get the categories right. Lion is a subcategory of unknown horrible thing. And you guys are surrounded by unknown horrible things just like people have always been surrounded by unknown horrible things. So, because you're just as prone to disease, not quite as prone, but fundamentally you're a finite being. and there's things everywhere that act in a predatory manner in relationship to you, and you will die. And so the idea that the material conditions of our environment have changed in a qualitative manner since the time we spent on the veldt it's an error of category. The mythological categories are categories that represent environmental entities, so to speak, some of which are social, that have existed for vast stretches of time and which exceed our capacity to detect with our senses. So one representation, for example, is the Great Father, or the Wise Old Man. And the Wise Old Man, or the Great Father, is fundamentally a representation of the dominance hierarchy. Now, the problem with the dominance hierarchy is you can't see it, but it's there. It's really there. And then figures like the Great Mother, especially the tarot, because most of the archetypal figures come in pairs, a positive element and a negative element. And that's because virtually everything that manifests itself to you in a complex environment, if you're a living being, takes with one hand and gives with the other. You know, so nature is benevolent and kind and wise and the source of all new knowledge, and also cancer and malarial mosquitoes and the tsetse fly and the guinea worm and all these things that are horrifying and destructive beyond belief, and you're stuck with both. And then society, we talked about this before, that's the Great Father. It's on the one hand, here you are, benevolently protected by your social surround. On the other hand, social structures tend towards tyranny and authoritarianism, and they oppress the individuals within them at the same time that they sustain their development. And so that's a dichotomous archetype. And then there's the individual, who's on the one hand a remarkable and wonderful creature, and on the other hand someone who's capable of atrocities like those that characterized the actions of many millions of people in the 20th century. Those are all archetypes. There are more archetypes than that. Like the archetype of the predatory reptile with something to offer, which is essentially a dragon, is the most fundamental archetypal representation. Jung found that representation in alchemical manuscripts, mostly in the form of the Ouroboros, which is a snake that eats its own tail. And it's a symbol of matter and spirit in union, because the snake is sort of matter, and the wings on the snake, the dragon, make it spirit. So it's like the fundamental elements of reality are matter and spirit in some kind of conjoined state. And the fundamental task of the human being is to come to terms with the nature of that unknown thing. Now think about it this way. Well, why would ancient people represent the unknown as such, as a reptilian, self-contained reptilian form that was both spiritual and material? Well, here's the reason. First, the unknown's dangerous, and you could be its prey. So you better have that representation at hand. And then you might ask, well, is that really the unknown? And then I would say, well, it depends absolutely on what you mean by really. From a Darwinian perspective, that was the best way to conceptualize the unknown. And then you might say, well, that doesn't make it real. And then I might say, are you sure about that? Is there anything more real than representations derived from Darwinian processes? The Darwinists would say no. Okay, so why is it matter and spirit? Or why is it winged and on the ground at the same time? Well, you can also understand this from a Piagetian perspective, and so that is because when you encounter the unknown, you separate the material world and the spiritual world. And the spiritual world is the psychological world. And so what you're doing when you encounter the unknown is you parse some of it up into the world, and you incorporate other elements of it into yourself. And the best way to think about that, I think, from a conceptual perspective, so it becomes more understandable, is that what you encounter when you encounter the unknown is patterned information. And you take some of that patterned information into yourself, even by doing something as simple as gripping something you want to pick up, because you're imitating the pattern of the thing that you want to pick up, and that's how you're transforming its structure into an element of your being. And so when you're exploring the unknown, it's a constructivist idea, you're simultaneously constructing the world and constructing yourself, and thus the inference is the unknown is made out of that which can be parsed out into psyche and matter. And it's dangerous. So it's a perfectly reasonable representation. And that's why it won't go away. So Jung's fundamental contribution, I would say, is his analysis of hero mythology. And I would say that's the fundamental element of his thinking. Now, the relationship between that and Nietzsche is fundamentally this. Nietzsche believed that once the religious systems collapsed, we would have to consciously produce our new set of values. But Jung believed that the psyche was the source of all value. And so that it wasn't a matter of creating new values, it was a matter of discovering the values that were already lying dormant and implicit within us. So, and the next thing I would say about that is, you all know this. You just don't know you know it. And so one of the reasons to be educated from a literary and historical perspective is that you can come to understand what you already know. Because if you don't understand it, then there's an element of your being, the element that knows it and acts it out, and there's another element which is sort of you as a personality that are completely at odds with one another. And that makes you weak. It makes you something that's divided within itself. Now, you're doing everything you can as a general rule to incorporate this information. Now, for a long time, it seems as if, as long as we acted it out and represented it symbolically, and didn't argue about the assumptions, it was more or less okay. But we're past that now. And in order for us to benefit from the same protective structures that our ancestors benefited from, we now have to understand what they mean consciously. And that's really what Jung was up to. What he was really trying to do was to resurrect deep religious representations from the dead, so to speak, and to make them conscious so people could align themselves with them again. Now, I'm going to show you something that's related to that. All right, now, so, I'm going to show you something from Pinocchio. Now, this is an initiation ritual. It's a journey to the depths, so it's a journey to the underworld. It's the consequence of a collapse in previous personality and the disintegration of that previous personality into a chaotic state prior to rebirth. Now, what happens in Pinocchio, which, by the way, was released at about the same time that World War II was brewing, and which also contains one of the best representations of the individual motivations for fascism that I've ever seen anywhere. That's the scenes that are associated with Pleasure Island. Remember, all the puppet is trying to become a real boy, right? So he's a marionette to begin with. Something else is pulling his strings. Well, for Jung, that's your habitual state of being. Something else is pulling your strings. Even the idea that you're autonomous is the consequence of something else pulling your strings. And for Jung, what you needed to do was find out exactly who and what is pulling your strings and decide if that's the direction in which you want to go. And that's really what happens to Pinocchio, because we're going to watch Pinocchio, part of it, in the Pinocchio story. He starts out as a marionette. Now, he's a marionette made by a good father, because Geppetto is a good father. He's a good craftsman and so on. So he's a marionette with a benevolent puppeteer. But as soon as he develops some autonomy, then he becomes prey to forces that are elements of the demonic archetype. In fact, the worst bad guy in the entire movie turns into Satan himself at one point in the movie. He basically has horns and a bright red face, and he manifests himself as so terrifying that the coyote, wolf, fox, and the cat that are trying to corrupt Pinocchio are terrified because they get they're criminals, they're petty criminals and deceptive and so forth, but when they get a look at who's pulling their strings, it's enough to terrify them. And so Pinocchio goes through a series of temptations of various sorts, including a Freudian temptation, and the Freudian temptation is to remain weak and sickly instead of becoming a real person, so it's an Oedipal problem. And another problem that faces Pinocchio is that he's offered false celebrity as a way of solving his life's problems, so he's offered the opportunity to become an actor, and what that means is a deceitful fake who's constructed a persona that makes him appear far more valuable than he really is. So the movie outlines two pathological modes of movement towards maturity. One being a phony, and the other taking the easy way out and hyper valuing all your pathology so that you become dependent. So anyways, and then another mode of pathological development is offered to Pinocchio, which is to do nothing but engage in short-term impulsive and destructive play. And that's on Pleasure Island. But when he goes to Pleasure Island, he finds that it's actually ruled by demonic forces with faceless entities who are transforming all the pleasure-seeking marionettes to braying donkeys who are slaves. It's like... So, Pinocchio escapes from that, and he does it basically by jumping into the unknown, and that's where we're going to start our exposure to his initiation. Okay, so now you can imagine what's happened is he was on Pleasure Island and everything went to hell, fundamentally. And so he jumped into the water to escape from that, and that's equivalent to plunging into chaos. And so chaos was an escape from pathological tyranny. And now he's tried to go home. So this is the psyche, in its search for maturation, runs into an obstacle, which is the tyrannical element of the Great Father that it cannot cope with, and it trots home, runs home. It's a defeat. Typical part of a hero story is the initial defeat of the hero when he encounters usually either the terrible Great Father or the terrible Great Mother. So this is a retrogressive, Jung would call this retrogressive restoration of the persona. So it's sort of like maybe you're a well-adapted adolescent and you live at home and you're a happy adolescent and everything's good at home, and then you go out to try to be an adult and you fail, and then when you come back home you try to act like a happy adolescent again, but you're not. What you are, in fact, is an unhappy adult. And if you move back to the happy adolescent mode of being, then it's false and pathological. You can't go home again, another typical motif in literature. Now the cricket, I can't tell you everything about this story. I can tell you a couple of strange things about it. One is that the cricket is Jiminy Cricket, right? And the initials of Jiminy Cricket are JC. And Jiminy Cricket was a common Southern American mild form of cursing. It's the equivalent of Jesus Christ. And so you might think, and of course, the cricket is Pinocchio's conscience. And, well, so then you might ask yourself, why in the world would a pejorative, mildly pejorative term for Jesus Christ be applied to a cricket who's guiding a puppet into the water to rescue his father from a whale? Why would any of that happen? And the answer to that is, you know why, but you can't say why. You can't say why you know, or what it is that you know. But the mere fact that it makes sense, and it does, is an indication from a Jungian perspective that you're operating at an archetypal level. You understand this. And so I could say, here's an example of why the cricket is a bug. Well, things bug you, right? We say that. Things bug me. Well, you should do something about the things that bug you, because that's your conscience calling to you. It's destiny in some sense manifesting itself as an unconscious impulse. That really bugs me. Means, if you can, you should do something about it, because you think about it, man. There's a lot of things out there that might bug you, but lots of them don't. But some of them do. Well, why do those bug you and not the other things? Well, that's a complicated question, but one potential answer to it is that there's part of your psyche that's oriented towards further development. Jung would call that the self. And that's like the totality of everything that you could be. And it's a strange sort of entity in some sense, because it's partly potential, and it's potential that expands across time. But the way that your potential totality calls to you in the present is by placing things in front of you that are your problem. And they announce themselves as your problem, and they do that by bothering you. So then if you pick up the task of fixing the things that bothers you, then you find the pathway to further expansion of your personality. So, and that's what's happening with Pinocchio. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about the Pinocchio movie, and that makes it incredibly sophisticated, is that despite the fact that the cricket is an avatar of Christ, so to speak, the cricket has things to learn just like Pinocchio. And so that's very cool, because it's so cool, it's so sophisticated, because it means that you do have a conscience that guides you, but until you establish a dialogue with it, both you and the conscience are immature. You have to establish a conscious dialogue with it, and then interact together in a manner that propels your development across time. And that'll stop you from being a marionette of forces that would make you a braying donkey who does nothing but slave away in salt mines. So, okay, so Pinocchio goes home. That doesn't work, and that's where we're going to start here. Okay, so what's happened there? Well, many, many things at multiple levels of reality simultaneously. And that's the characteristic of an archetypal story. So on one level, Pinocchio's too old to go home. He can't go home to his father because in some sense he's already transcended his father. So there are things, for example, that your father can't help you with, and the reason for that is that he doesn't know any more about the situation than you do, and he can't. And so that's where his knowledge limits out. So that would be sort of on the personal level. And then on the transpersonal level, which would be the deeper archetypal level, what's happening to Pinocchio is exactly what Nietzsche described at the end of the 19th century. Because remember that Geppetto is his creator, and now he's dead, he's gone. And so Pinocchio is bereft of placement, so to speak. His soul has been corrupted, and he doesn't know what to do about it. And when he returns to his family home, or when he returns to his tradition, what he finds is nothing. Okay, so then what happens? Well, this is another thing that you'll swallow with just no problem whatsoever. Well, this dove comes along that's sort of golden and glowing and drops a note right in front of him. Now, you may remember, and perhaps you don't, but the star from which the dove comes is a representation of the blue fairy. And the blue fairy is the positive element of the unknown in the Pinocchio movie. And so what it basically is saying that when you're despairing because your father has died and your tradition has nothing to offer, that the positive element of the unknown may provide you with a message about where to go if you pay enough attention. That would be an intuition. Or it would be the automatic attraction of your interest to a new thing by forces that you do not understand. So one of the real ways of coming to grips with the idea of the active unconscious is to understand that you cannot control what you're interested in. And so then you might ask, well, if it's not you, what is it? And if you think about that problem long enough, you'll start to understand what Jung was talking about, because that is the way that you can understand in your own life that the things that direct you as a being are not things that you consciously choose. In fact, they're not even things that you can consciously choose. They're directed by other forces. So anyways, the dove drops a message in front of Pinocchio and the cricket. Now it's the cricket that reads it, so it's the same idea as what bugs you, so to speak. The cricket is the interpreter. Okay, so now what have we found out? Well, we found out that God the Father and God the Father, the Creator, are not in fact dead, which is what Nietzsche pronounced, but alive in some weird way in this horrible creature at the bottom of the ocean. And so what does Pinocchio decide to do? He decides to go find him. That's actually what you're doing at university, by the way. For all the chaos that you experience when you come to university and all the uncertainty and all the doubt, what you're trying to do is to resurrect your dead father from the bottom of the ocean. And if you do that, you won't be a marionette. And if you don't, you will be. Now this is very interesting because the conscience here plays a very dichotomous role. So on the one hand, Pinocchio is often ahead of his conscience, so to speak, so he's taking the leading role, and the dialogue is kind of choppy and neither of them know exactly what they're doing. But in this situation, it's very paradoxical because you can see Pinocchio's been half turned into brain jackass at this point, something you might well consider when you remember your adolescence. So in this point, the cricket, his conscience, does two things. It warns him how horrible this is going to be and how utterly dangerous it is, and then at the same time, it helps him prepare and goes along with him. And so it's quite comical, so watch what happens here. Okay, so I've cut this a little bit, but what happens in the movie is that he goes to the bottom of the ocean and he starts to ask about Monstro. And as soon as he asks any of the fish down there, the denizens of the sub-oceanic world, where Monstro is, they just run away. And so Monstro is he who cannot be named, right? And I'm sure you've encountered that in your reading before, right? That's the hallmark of, in the Harry Potter series. Right, see, now you've done it. Yeah. So this represents something so terrible that it can't even be talked about. Okay, so what happens is Pinocchio ends up not only at the bottom of the ocean, but he has to go to the deepest part of the bottom of the ocean where the most terrible thing rests. And so we're cutting to the point where he does that. So now you might ask, how did Geppetto get in the whale? And the answer to that is it's never really made that clear in the movie. But I can tell you some things about that, is that if you conceptualize your historical tradition as a personality, like a body of laws and customs, say, it's not alive. It's dead, right? Because it's composed of the past. And because it's dead, it can't come up with anything new. So if it encounters something new, it's stopped. And that's what's happened to Geppetto, is that he's engulfed by this entity that represents the absolute unknown, and he cannot figure out how to get out. And the reason for that is none of the things he knows So none of the things that history has produced as a body of knowledge are sufficient to deal with the fundamental problem. That doesn't mean they're useless. It just means that just like the puppet is lost without the father is also lost without the puppet. And that's the relationship between you and history, your history. When you study history, you think, well, you're studying a record of events in the past, and that's not right. What you're studying is the circumstances that gave rise to you as a being. And unless you understand your history in every way you possibly can, then you're an incomplete creature. You don't know enough to move forward. In the same way, your culture, being composed of dead fathers, so to speak, can't progress without you because you're its eyes. And there's an Egyptian story that features the god Horus, who I've talked to you about before, who actually resurrects his father from the dead by giving him an eye. So Geppetto can't figure out how to get out of this whale without help. So he's kind of pushing up tombstones there, you might note. All right, now something very sophisticated happens here. So, and I have to explain it to you at multiple levels at the same time. So now, Geppetto is hungry. And when the whale opens its mouth, a lot of fish come in. Now one of the things I want you to think about, you can just put this in the back of your mind, is that one of the oldest symbolic representations of Christ is a fish. And all of his followers were fishermen. And so there's this weird relationship between the messianic figure who's at the base of it, at least at the base of Christian culture, and the idea of things that are pulled up from the depths. Now here's what happens in this part of the movie. It's so amazing. So Geppetto is looking for fish. And the reason for that is he doesn't think he can get out of the whale, and so he might as well have some fish while he's in there. And so he's given up on getting out. Now what happens is that the whale swallows Pinocchio as if he's a fish. So Pinocchio is put into the same category as fish, and it happens to Geppetto a couple of times. He mistakes Pinocchio for a fish. You'll see. So what that means in some sense is that Geppetto can't distinguish between the fish that will feed you for the day and whatever it is that Pinocchio represents. And so you could think about Pinocchio as a fisherman instead of as a fish. And so you can think about it this way, and here's an old saying. If you give a man a fish, you feed him for one day, but if you teach him to fish, you feed him forever. And so the idea is it's better to develop the skill to acquire something than it is to have the thing. Now, what Pinocchio represents is, he's like a meta fish. I know this is a strange way of thinking about it. Geppetto's problem isn't that he's hungry. His problem is that he can't get out of the whale, and so what he's fishing for isn't something to eat, it's something that will help him get out of the whale. But he can't recognize the difference between the proximate solution, which is so that he'll just no longer be hungry, so he's got a very short-term outlook, and a solution to the much broader problem. So what happens is, the whale swallows a bunch of fish, and Pinocchio's in there, and Geppetto's fishing away, and he catches Pinocchio. And Pinocchio announces himself, and Geppetto tells him to be quiet because he's interfering with him fishing, and then when he turns to hug Pinocchio, because he wakes up, he actually hugs a fish, and then he discards the fish. So then he figures out that Pinocchio's there. Then Geppetto decides that, well, they're going to have to live inside the whale. And it's another idea of his blindness at this point, because he's composed of the dead past, so to speak. So what Pinocchio does is start to destroy the ship itself, which is what they're floating in the whale, to start a fire. And the fire makes the whale mad enough to spit them out. And the whale then transforms itself into a dragon and tries to kill them, because it's a fire-breathing entity at that point. And so part of the understory is, it's better to figure out how to fish than to fish, or that more profoundly, it's better to figure out how to do something than to merely benefit from the thing itself. Pinocchio represents that which can do new things. So he's a hero. And he's willing to destroy part of the current order, that's the ship, in order to produce a new strategy that will actually free them from the whale. Now he wants to get his father out of there too. So that's what happens in the next 5 minutes, I would say. Okay, so now there's a shock here because essentially in some sense the entity that's going to provide the solution to this very complex problem has arrived on the scene. But it's quite damaged. First of all, it's been speaking improperly, right? So that's an adolescent representation. So it brays a lot of nonsense. And it's been corrupted in a variety of ways. And so, you know, to some degree what that means is that as you mature and you're moving away from your mere marionette status, your interaction with society, like Rousseau said, corrupts you in all sorts of ways. I mean, you're participating in that corruption, but it still happens. But in the representation in the movie, the truth of the matter is it doesn't matter if you've been corrupted to some degree, as long as you haven't absolutely sacrificed your capacity for true speech and vision. So, you know, that's a pretty hopeful message, because Pinocchio is by no means a perfect entity, but he might be good enough.
Pinocchio! What's the matter? Those ears! Ears? Oh, me! That's nothing. I got a tail, too. Pinocchio! What's happened to you?
See, that's also an indication there of why people are often unwilling to form a representation with, so to speak, form a relationship with the archetype of the Great Father, because to some degree the archetype is a figure of perfection, and the individual in relationship to that archetype is always pathologically flawed. And so the embarrassment of that realization, which is exactly what's happening to Pinocchio right now, is often enough to stop people from doing it. So what that would say, what that means in some sense, is that in order for you to mature in the fullest possible manner, you have to understand the manner in which you're deeply flawed in relationship to your potential as it might be historically determined. And that's a very bitter thing to do. You know, it's much easier, and people do this all the time, to engage in half-witted, formulaic, ideological criticisms of the system as a whole. It's like, you know, the probability that the system is more flawed than you is pretty damn low. So you might want to start with, you know, getting rid of your donkey ears and your tail and stop braying nonsense before you judge the entire, you know, historical process by which human beings have come into being. So, anyways, that's kind of what that means.
Nothing else matters.
Come on, you big moose. Open up, my pet. Hey! Let it out.
Hey, what? Beat it, you buzzard.
Get out.
Oh, no, son. I have tried every way. I even burned a rat.
A rat? That's it.
Huh?
We'll take the rat, and when the rat opens his mouth...
No. Now listen. He only opens his mouth when he's eating. Then everything comes in. Nothing goes out.
Oh.
It's hopeless, Pinocchio. Come, make a nice fire and we cook some of the fish.
A fire.
Okay, so this is very interesting too, because so Pinocchio ends up being a master of fire. Well, you can think about that as, there is a book written a while back by a primatologist who also wrote Demonic Males, Richard Wrangham, and he talked about the origin of fire. And as far as Wrangham is concerned, we invented fire about 2 million years ago, and that enabled us to cook food, and that enabled us to swap intestinal length for brain. So if you look at a chimpanzee, you know, chimpanzees are like the ultimate in couch potatoes, right? They're about this high and they're shaped like this. They have this huge barrel body, and the reason they have that is because they eat leaves, and so they have to spend like 8 hours a day eating leaves. They will eat meat if they can get it. They have to spend like 8 hours a day eating leaves and just chewing them over and over, because like leaves, A, they don't want to be eaten, so they're pretty tough and inedible, and B, they don't have any nutritive quality to speak of. So the chimpanzee has to spend all of its time chewing, which is a rather mindless endeavor, all things considered. Whereas human beings, 2 million years ago or thereabouts, invented fire, and as a consequence of that, we could cook meat, and meat is incredibly energy rich. And it's easy to digest once it's cooked. And so the consequence of the invention of fire was that we're the way we are today. We could have a brain instead of a gut. And so the idea that Pinocchio's mastery of fire, and it's as something more than merely a means of cooking. That's how it started out, right? But you can think of our entire technological capacity as stemming from the mastery of fire. Now, the other thing you can think of, and this is very much worth considering, is that Pinocchio masters fire, and that turns the whale into a dragon. And so the idea there, too, is that, and this is an old idea, is that our technological prowess is something that makes nature itself angry. And, of course, you might say, well, do you believe this? And the answer to that is, well, how many of you have environmentalist leanings? And that's exactly the story that you're following, because you're still wondering about whether or not mastery of fire was in somehow against the natural order, and then it will end up in all of our deaths. And you know, that's a reasonable thing to worry about, but not mastering it was going to end up pretty badly too. So
That's it.
Yes, and then we'll all eat it.
A great big fire. Lots of smoke.
Smoke? Oh, yeah, sure. The smoke especially tastes good.
So here what happens is that in the midst of this complete chaos, Pinocchio has a choice, and the choice is he can either save himself, which is a very, very selfish choice, and reduces him to an ahistorical individual because he has no relationship left with his father, or he can put himself at great risk and rescue his father, finish the process, stop his father from drowning, and complete. Okay, so Pinocchio dies, and then his father brings him home. And so because he's rescued his father, the benevolent spirit of nature appears, resurrects him, and turns him into a real human being.
Prove yourself brave, truthful, and unselfish. Someday you will be a real boy. A real kid.
So it's pretty funny, as far as I'm concerned, that the answer to Nietzsche's great question manifested itself in mid-1930s in the form of an animated child's movie. So, and that's an example. It's an example of a number of things. It's an example of how archetypes work. It's also an example of how artists are on the edge of discovery all the time. And they discover things they don't even understand. So, we'll see you next Tuesday. Psychoanalytic thought today. It's depth psychology, that's a better way to think about it. The psychoanalysis technically is Freudian. And Freud was not the only contributor to the corpus of psychoanalytic ideas. Adler, who we won't talk much about, was certainly... Adler was smart, and he's underrated today. He wasn't as charismatic as Freud and Jung. And he didn't have the same flair for writing, I suppose. But his ideas foreshadowed the development of later cybernetic ideas, which we will talk about by a good margin. So Adler really had some smart things to say. Jung is the person we're going to talk about today and next time. And I'm going to talk about him in some ways indirectly, because the best way to understand Jung is to show you what you do with his ideas rather than really presenting the ideas themselves. But I can give you a bit of an overview. So, one of the things that differentiates the depth psychologists from, say, behavior therapists, and even from cognitive scientists, is that you might say in one way they're more mystical, which means more from the romantic tradition than the cognitive scientists and the behaviorists. So there's a temperamental split there, because people who are high in openness, and both Freud and Jung were very, very high in trait openness, are very interested in the domain of the imagination and the domain of fantasy, because they have very active imaginations and they have very active fantasy lives, and they're good visualizers. And so one of the things I've noticed in my clinical practice, there's always been a joke about depth psychologists, that if you go see a Freudian, you have Freudian dreams, and if you go see a Jungian, you have Jungian dreams. And I suppose that means if you go to a behavior therapist that you don't have any dreams at all. But I actually think there's some truth in that, because the more pragmatic people, the more practical people, are not going to be attracted to therapists who deal with issues that have to do, say, with the imagination and fantasy. And so there's a natural parsing. And one of the things I've noticed in my clinical practice is that imaginative people, so those would be open and creative people, have a dream life that cries out to be interpreted in archetypal terms. Like I've had clients, a number of them now. I have one right now. I mean, his dream life is it's so rich, it's remarkable. He's a genius dreamer. Every time he comes in, he has 2 dreams or 3 dreams. They're coherent, they're complexly plotted, they're interesting, and they chart what's going on in his life, and they tell him what he should do. It's great. But everyone isn't like that. I also have clients who never dream at all. And then I've also seen when I've lectured to people, and I see this most particularly in medical students, because I've lectured a bit to medical students, is like, so maybe I'll do a seminar for the medical students and tell them a little bit about the symbols of transformation, really, because they're involved in, first of all, transforming, because they're medical students, and so you have to transform them into a doctor, and also, of course, they're helping people through transformations all the time, often negative, but not always, sometimes positive, because sometimes you get better. And so it's useful, possibly, for them to understand those processes more deeply. Generally, with the medical school students, I do half lecture that's more on like trait psychology and more behavioral, and half of it on the more symbolic stuff, which is kind of like this class is. And there's always about half the medical students on whom the more symbolic stuff just falls flat. They just don't. It's like talking about color to people who are colorblind. And I've thought about this a lot, and I really do think it's based in temperamental differences. So, you know, if you have an active fantasy life, and you have an active imagination, and you're a good visualizer, and you dream a lot, then that's the sort of person you are. And if you're on the other end of the scale, which would be that you're very conscientious, let's say, and very low in openness, which also tends to make you more conservative in your political presuppositions, by the way, then dream analysis is probably not for you, partly because you're just not going to come up with that many dreams. And even if you do, they won't necessarily be informative. So, you know, there's been a very long battle in some ways in the psychological and psychiatric community between people who take different perspectives on how you might address psychological problems. But I don't know if the issue of type has been thought about seriously enough in that regard, because we're really only starting to understand the dimensions, the actual dimensions of personality properly, and to figure out what it means to be on one end of, say, openness and versus the other one. Especially if you're intelligent. You can be intelligent, not open. Those are complicated people. They've got very analytical minds. They make good lawyers. Like lawyers are often, and this is something you might think about if you're planning to become a lawyer, if you're high in openness, it's a bad job for you. You will not be happy. You need to be really conscientious, like off the scale. And it helps to be disagreeable too. So, because if you're too agreeable, well, you're supposed to win if you're a lawyer. You're not supposed to like nicely let the other person win, you know. You're supposed to fight to win. And so you have to be kind of fighty to do that. And if you're high in agreeableness, then it's a job that's kind of grates against your temperament. So, anyways. So, Jung, I think the best way to think about Jung is that he was a student of two people. He was a student of Friedrich Nietzsche, and he was a student of Freud. And although the Freudians, when they write the history of psychoanalytic thought, they pretty much portray Jung as like a derivative thinker of Freud. It's not the right way to think about his positioning historically, because in some ways what Jung was trying to do was to answer the question that Nietzsche posed at the end of the 19th century. And the reason Jung was trying to answer it was because he believed it was the most important question that had been posed at the end of the 19th century. And that was, you know, there's a famous quote by Nietzsche, right? I'm sure you've all heard it, and that's the quote that God is dead. So what Nietzsche said essentially was, God is dead and we have killed him. That's a different idea. And we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood. And so it wasn't like a triumphal statement on Nietzsche's part, even though when you hear it quoted, you always hear it quoted that way. It's like it's a sort of victory, God is dead, you know, or something to celebrate. It's not what Nietzsche thought at all. In fact, he thought all hell was going to break loose because of it. And he predicted as much in the 1870s. I mean, he predicted what was going to happen in the 20th century with ridiculous accuracy. Like, it's uncanny. And that's partly because, you know, Nietzsche was one of these people like Jung who are very grounded in their deep, deep, deep imaginations. And so they get wind of the currents that are moving through society long before normal people do. So in some sense, you know, you can imagine that in any given population, even when you guys, there's some of you guys who are living like 50 years ago, and there's some of you living now, and there's some of you living 50 years in the future. It depends on how intelligent, imaginative versus how conservative you are. Because it's not like everyone develops at exactly the same historical rate. And you get people like Nietzsche, for example, or Dostoevsky, they're like 100 years ahead of everyone else. And so, you know, people don't even know what to do with them. But Stendhal was like that too, the writer. He wrote in the 1830s, and he was convinced that he was 100 years ahead of his time. And stylistically, that was probably about right. So, and the people who were prophets, regarded as prophets in say, Old Testament tradition, they were the same sort of people. It's like they had their ear to the ground in a sense, and they could tell what was going on underneath everybody's facade. It echoed in them, and often, as the stories go, and I'm sure they have a mythological accuracy to them, the people who were picking up the underground currents indicating often catastrophe felt absolutely compelled, even at the risk of their own skin, to warn people. So Jung was definitely one of these people. And now, this question, God is dead and we have killed him, led Nietzsche to pose another question, which was, well, what are we going to do to replace him? Because Nietzsche believed, and I think he was absolutely right about this, I can't see how it could be otherwise. He believed that the morality that had structured Western society was predicated on the fundamental axiom of divinity. And so, like as far as Nietzsche was concerned, the whole corpus of morality was dependent on that axiom being true, or at least being accepted as true. And when that axiom was knocked out by, say, the conflict between science and religion, because in some sense that's what did it, then the whole system no longer had anything to stand on and could become entirely questionable. And so Nietzsche pointed that out, and then Dostoevsky, who was writing basically at the same time, said, well, if there's no God, then anything is permitted. And what he meant by that was, really in some sense what he meant by that was, morality turns into what you can get away with. Because there's nothing final about it, there's nothing transcendent about it. And like, we've played this problem out intellectually. You guys are still right in the middle of this battle, whether you know it or not. I mean, so what happened in the 20th century was that one of the consequences of that loss of a fundamental underpinning led Europe to swing radically to political extremes. You know, the Nazis were, to think of the Nazis without thinking of that as a religious transformation is, like, that's just not right. It was a religious transformation, and it wasn't a good one. So, like, it was a regression in some sense to a morality that was way pre-Christian. Like, it was not good. And then, you know, you had the same, it was like the rise of the state as an alternative to God. Well, we saw what that produced. It produced hundreds of millions of painful deaths, and it just about destroyed the world. So it was a bad problem. And, you know, we sort of skirted our way through that miraculously, you know. I don't really think World War II came to an end until 1989, you know, because there was the whole Cold War period after the Germans and the Japanese had surrendered. But I mean, we just went from one war to another. We just went to another one that everyone was too afraid to fight. It was still a war, you know, and that didn't end until 1989. And by some miracle, God only knows why, you know, it never degenerated into a thermonuclear exchange. And it was close, man. We just barely squeaked through that. There were two times during that period, one in 1964 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where they had those bloody ICBMs primed. And so the way they worked was in the control panel, which kind of looked like a Star Trek, you know, the old Star Trek sets. There'd be like a panel here, and there was a little place you could put a key, and then about 20 feet over there, there'd be another guy with a key, and if he turned his key and held it for 10 seconds at the same time, he turned his key and held it for 10 seconds, then the missile launched. And an intercontinental ballistic missile is a bullet, and I mean that technically. It's not a guided missile. Once you launch it, like you shoot a bullet, it's gone. You don't get to tell the bullet to come back once it's gone. You can turn around like a cruise missile. An intercontinental ballistic missile, it goes where you aimed it, and you don't get to bring it back. And so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the keys were in the locks. So we were 10 seconds away. Man, I tell you, that was a tight keyhole. We barely squeaked through that one. And it looks like by about 1989, that collective consciousness, or Jung would say the collective unconscious of the human race, had decided that, well, maybe having it all end in like apocalyptic annihilation wasn't necessarily for the best. It's interesting because writers like Goethe, he wrote Faust, and Faust is this tale of a man who makes a bet with the devil so that he can acquire infinite knowledge, essentially. And the devil in Faust is named Mephistopheles. And Goethe was trying to explain what human evil, or evil per se, what its motive was. And he did a lovely job. It's so smart what he said. He said, the devil's basic hypothesis, and of course Goethe expresses this in poetry, is that life is so unbearably cruel and random and tragic that it would be better if it had never existed at all. And, you know, believe me, there'll be times in your life where you think that, you know, where something has just knocks you off your feet in a completely unjust manner, you know. And that thought, it'll rise up. And, like, it's a compelling thought. And I think that's the thought that human beings were wrestling with. Well, we've been wrestling with it forever, but we didn't really vote on it till 1989. You know, and life barely won. And, you know, life is a troublesome business. It's a tragedy. And, you know, everyone asks themselves now and then is if their consciousness is worth the pain. Well, the answer to that is it depends on how you live. That is the answer to that. But, you know, that's a complicated answer. And just because you know that answer doesn't mean that you know how to live. Anyways, what's happened since 1989, as far as I'm concerned, is that intellectuals, who are often possessed by the worst sorts of demons, because they actually think that their intelligence can guide them properly in like the complex moral landscape. It's not the case. You see most intellectuals, and this is certainly the case of most intellectuals in the universities, especially in the late 20th century, they were committed Marxists, like way past when they should have been. You know, George Orwell, by 1955, he was a left-winger, brilliant guy. He'd already figured out that whatever was going on in the Soviet Union was not good. So, you know, like if you had your eyes open, you were done with that by, 10 years after World War II. But people like Jean-Paul Sartre were members of the Communist Party way longer than they had any ethical right whatsoever to be. You know, it was an absolutely murderous philosophy. But intellectuals toyed with that. They still toy with it in the universities, except it's turned into postmodernism, which is Marxism under a new guise. And a lot of the postmodern thought is not only left-wing disguised, but it's also nihilistic. And that's actually the other problem that the death of God produces. One is, okay, I don't have a religious foundation. I don't have any foundation under my feet to buttress my moral claims, or even to sort of help me determine what life is worth in the face of tragedy. So I need something to replace that, and then poof, that's the state, which is a really bad replacement. Because if you think God's bad, like, you just try Stalin on for size for a while. And Mao as well, and Hitler as well. It's not like this was a phenomena that was only linked to one, say, culture of people. Everybody became susceptible to it, and the same murderous thing happened every time people tried that. So it was China, Cambodia, Vietnam, like wherever the communists got into power, man, people died by the hundreds of thousands. So Pol Pot, the guy who emptied the Cambodian cities and killed 3 million people. He got his graduate degree at the Sorbonne in France. And he said what he was going to do when he went back to Cambodia. He didn't outline the whole murderousness element, but he certainly had all the theory laid down in his fine French academy. So, we mess with ideas in the universities. And if we don't do it properly, like people die, it's important to get your ideas right. So, one answer to the death of God is you worship the state. The other is you worship nothing. It's nihilism. There's no distinction between anything. And everything is pointless. And there's a massive strain of that sort of underground theorizing in postmodernism. And a psychoanalyst, especially a Jungian, would look at the postmodern response, which is nihilistic, and the fascist response, which is sort of recourse to the state, as motivated by something even deeper than that. And that's the sort of process that Nietzsche was describing. Now, for Jung, he wrote a book called Ion, for example, and if you want to have nightmares for the rest of your life, that's a really good book to read. I mean, that book just terrified me. Because Jung, what he did in that book basically was investigate the fantasy that he believed that all of Western civilization had been predicated on for the last 4,000 years. Because Jung really believed that what drove human beings was, and it's a Piagetian perspective in some weird ways, was the revelation of the successive unconscious revelation of fantasies were at the forefront of our movement into unknown territory. So it's like there's unknown territory, and then there's known territory, but there's this weird intermediary space between them. And that intermediary space where you kind of know but kind of don't know, that's where your imagination plays. And of course that's the case, right? Because when you encounter something and you really don't know much about it, you imagine what it might be. And so it takes on the structures of your imagination. And so in some sense, what you're dealing with as you move through history, you expand your domain of knowledge into the unknown, is you encounter your own fantasy. Anyways, if you want to know about that, you could read like volume 9 and 9.1 and 9.2 of Jung. One's called Archetypes of the Collective Unconscious, and the other's called Ion. But like it'll take you a while to crack them. You have to beat your head against those books quite a bit, because what Jung is outlining in some sense is so shocking, it's almost impossible to grasp. Once you get the picture, all of a sudden things flip around because you understand what he's talking about. But before then, man, it's tough going. It's funny because Jung has been... there's a guy named Richard Knoll who wrote a biography of Jung, and he was a jealous guy, I think. And he was crooked too, because his book was called The Aryan Christ, and he used like Nazi imagery on the cover. And it was his publisher that talked him into doing that because he thought the book would sell more. It's like, you don't do that. Well, or if you do, that indicates really what you're up to, right? Because of what you're willing to allow to happen to your work. So anybody who would have thought about that wouldn't have used Nazi imagery to gain economic utility out of writing a criticism of Jung, because it's a crooked maneuver. So then you have to think, okay, what's he up to? Why is he doing this? Now Jung has been he accused Jung, for example, of basically starting a cult. And I can understand that. But what I found so amusing about Knoll's book is that what Jung was actually up to was so much more terrifying than a mere cult, that it was sort of like accusing a serial killer of stealing a loaf of bread. It's like, yeah, well, maybe he stole a loaf of bread, but compared to what he was actually up to, it's really not relevant. So, I mean, Jung was trying to bring the primordial imagination back into the world, and to make people conscious of it. It's like, whew, that's something, man. Really. That's really something. So, that reading, I read everything Jung wrote, except the books that were like published after his collected works. I read some of those. It took me a long time. And it just tore me into bits. Like, I didn't know what the hell, which way was up halfway through those books. I mean, Nietzsche's bad enough, because Nietzsche will set out to destroy your presuppositions. In fact, I have a client right now who's being left like depressed for like 5 years because he wasn't particularly educated, and he, started reading Nietzsche, and he had been a Christian, and he thought, well, I'm a Christian, I can take on Nietzsche. It's like, no, you can't. No, you can't. Like, Nietzsche was so smart that it's mind-boggling. He came up with the best narcissistic statement, I think, that's ever been written. And this is what he was like, because he was a very sick man, and he could only write for very short periods of time, so he tried to cram everything he could into a single sentence. And so each sentence is like a little bomb. But one of his, now and then he'd write, something self-referential. So one phrase of his is, I write in a sentence what other people write in a book. That's pretty good, eh? That's a good brag. But then he topped it right away after. He said, what other people can't even write in a book. Yeah, so that's pretty good. Like, narcissism, and then like he just punched through that. It wasn't even there. Yeah, but it's true. Like, that's the thing, it's true. So it wasn't narcissism. I mean, for anyone else it would have been. For him it was just true. So, yeah. So, back to Jung. Nietzsche sort of hypothesized that in order for people to overcome the psychological consequences of the destruction of their religious underpinnings, they would have to transform themselves virtually into the thing that they had killed. So Nietzsche's, and this was, believe me, for Nietzsche, this was like a revelatory solution. He came up with this in a book called Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now everybody who reads Nietzsche starts to read Thus Spake Zarathustra because it's got such a cool title, but you shouldn't read that book. At least not until you've read, say, Beyond Good and Evil and other books that he wrote, because Thus Spake Zarathustra is a weird book. It's like an Old Testament revelation. And it really is. It's like, it's a fantasy. This man comes down from the mountain and he starts to spout off like poetic revelations. And the rest of Nietzsche's books are like very, very clear and cutting thought. Whereas this one is it's like a Shakespearean drama almost, you know. And the reason for that is because Nietzsche was reaching beyond the grip of his intellect to try to formulate answers to questions that he could not grasp, because what he was trying to figure out is, well, as human beings have developed cognitively, in some sense, we've escaped from our culture and our instincts. And when we're embedded in our culture and our instincts, we're embedded unconsciously within a religious framework. It's the framework of presuppositions from which we emerged. Like, people didn't think up religions. What do you, there's some little weird little, what would you call, conspiracy going on for 3,000 years? It's like, no, it's not about power. Even though it can be twisted to be about power, everything can be, or twisted to be about economics. It's about fantasy. You know, you look inside a European cathedral, all you see is fantasy. It's in brilliant lights portrayed everywhere. It's trying to say something to you. Well, what's it trying to say? Well, it turned out when people asked themselves that, instead of just acting it out, they hadn't got a clue what it said. They had no idea what it said. Any more than you guys know why you have Christmas trees. So how many of you have Christmas trees? Yeah, why? Oh, well, I don't know. I never noticed we had Christmas trees, you know. No, but my point is that in a culture, you follow the customs because that's what you do. But then when you wake up a bit and think, well, you're just like a Piagetian child who is taken out of the game and forced to look at it. It's like, well, why are you playing that game and what are the rules? Well, I never thought about it before. Well, as soon as people started to think about the games they were playing, it was often because they encountered other people who apparently thought differently, you know. So if you're like a marauding Christian and you go into the East and all of a sudden you come up with a Buddhist and he's smart, it's like you two have big problems, right? Because you're smart and he's smart and you don't think the same way, at least apparently you don't think the same way at all. So even if you say, well, those Buddhists, you know, we should just wipe them out, it doesn't matter because their thoughts are already there and they've been working on them for like a couple of thousand years, and whether you like it or not, they're going to make you think. And once you start thinking about your religion, you're in trouble. And so that's the situation we're in right now. So Jung took this problem that Nietzsche had posed seriously, because Jung was caught up quite dramatically in the events of Nazi Germany. Now, you know, when we think about Nazi Germany, we think, of course, that it was perfectly obvious that the Nazis were the perpetrators and that, you know, everyone else was the victim, and that if we were there, we would have clearly seen that and we wouldn't have been Nazis. And it's like, that's not true. That isn't how it worked, because these things happen slowly. They sort of happen piece by piece. You know, we started seeing a similar thing happen, I think, after the Twin Towers fell in New York. You know, it's like people gave up 5-10% of their civil liberties in like a month. You know, and it was okay. It was like, it wasn't okay. It wasn't okay. And it just shows you how easy that sort of thing can start. You know, the Germans were under tremendous stress in the 1930s. Their whole economy blew out. They had to, like, take wheelbarrows full of billions of marks to buy a piece of bread. Their currency fell to zero. Unemployment was staggeringly high. They were paying off debts like mad because of the First World War. And there was a real threat that the communists were going to start a revolution. It's like, you don't have problems like that. So the Germans had no idea what to do, you know, and Hitler was a canny person with a brilliant sense of drama. I mean, he was a master of dark fire, that guy. And I think his unconscious fantasy was, let's see how much we can destroy before we die in the purifying flames. That was Hitler. So, and he was a compelling person, and the fantasy that he had in the back of his mind, I'll tell you how that developed at one point. It was a very hard thing to escape from. And that's why the Germans became Nazis. This was like magic that had emerged, and it was black magic. So Jung was very interested in this because he was in the Germanic-speaking areas of the world when this happened, and he felt himself pulled very strongly by what the Nazis were doing, especially in the early stages of the development of the political platform, because things did stabilize. You know, and then they stabilized before they went completely out of control. And of course, looking in retrospect, you can see the seeds of what eventually transpired to become such a catastrophe. But at the time, it was by no means self-evident that such a thing was going to occur, especially given all the other horrible things that were likely to occur. So Jung had a vision at one point on a train, I think it was in Switzerland, that Europe had become so covered with blood that the blood was starting to flow over the mountains into Switzerland, because of course Switzerland is neutral. And he said it was one of the most horrifying nightmares of his life. And this was in, I think, 1930. It was late 1930s anyway, so it was a premonition of war. And he spent a lot of time trying to understand, well, if you weren't going to become a fascist and worship the state, and you weren't going to become a nihilist and worship nothing, what in the world were you going to do exactly to orient yourself? And how would you protect yourself against the attractions of blind state identification, for example, or the attractions of nihilism? You know, you might say, well, nihilism has no attraction at all because it says to you, everything is irrelevant, nothing you do has any importance, because that's nihilistic, basically. Well, what's the psychoanalyst would say, what's the secondary gain from that? Like, yeah, you say that's what you believe, and maybe you even act it out. And you also say, well, you've come to that conclusion through, you know, a rational process of deliberation. But the psychoanalyst would say, it's kind of convenient that also alleviates you of all responsibility, isn't it? And it kind of sheds a little dampness on your claim to pristine cognition as the driving force behind your adoption of that theory. You know, it's like the patriot who claims that, you know, the reason that he's kicking someone in the head is because he's patriotic. It's like, no. You're patriotic so that you can kick someone in the head and still look at yourself in the mirror in the morning. It has nothing to do with rational deliberation. And so the psychoanalysts, and Jung was like this in particular, you know, they were always extremely skeptical about people's rational claims about their commitments to ideology, and rightly so. One of the things Jung said, that I love, he said some things that were so brilliant, was that people didn't have ideas. Ideas had people. And when you think that it's like, I think this is so funny, it's like Dawkins' idea of the meme. You know, some of you, how many of you read Dawkins? He's, you know, yeah, okay, so Dawkins has this idea of meme. It's so funny to read Dawkins because he's like 20% of the way to being a Jungian without even knowing it. And so he's produced this idea called meme, which is they're ideas. A meme is an idea that sort of has an independent existence in a sense because it can infect different minds or move from mind to mind. And he kind of thinks of it more like a fad. Well, the archetypes are memes, except they're no fads. They're memes that have lasted for like 20,000 years, or maybe 20 million years. We have no idea how old they are. And Jung got where Dawkins was going, like, you know, 50 years before and 200 stories deeper. So it's so funny to read Dawkins because what he is searching for has already been figured out by Jung, but he's so prejudiced against any kind of religious thinking that there's no way he'll ever find it. So one of the things Jung did was he deeply studied the substructures of thought. So for Jung, like, you know, we talked about Piaget a bit, and we said, for Piaget, you kind of built your brain from your body upward. Brilliant idea. It's so smart. But Jung has a lot of Piaget in him. It's more implicit. But for Jung, not only was the substructures of your thought biological, and so therefore based in your body, but your body was also cultural and historical. You know, so partly because you're an evolved creature, and so God only knows what's in there. 3.5 billion years worth of weirdness that you can draw on, or that can move you where it wants to move you. But also, you're being shaped by cultural dynamics all the time. And human beings in particular, like we're just watching each other like mad all the time to see what we're up to, what people think of us, how we should be behaving, are we being boring, are people attracted to us? It's like we're social right to the core. And that's another way that you can understand an archetype. It's like part of the archetype is that we are social to the core. So we're interested in other people. And more if you're extroverted, and less if you're introverted. But it doesn't matter. By the standards of, say, solitary animals, we're so social, it's just unbelievable. And so that's built in. It's built in. What's built in is that you find that interesting. That's the archetype. The archetype is whatever it is that makes you find that interesting. It's beyond your control. Like if you're extroverted, you're interested in people. You didn't decide that. It decided it for you. The question is, what is it? Well, it's your brain, your limbic system, whatever the hell that means. Like, we don't know what that means. We have no idea how your brain produces consciousness. Like, I'm dead serious. We haven't got a clue. And what that indicates to me, since we've been hacking away at it for, say, 400 years, is that the way we think about consciousness is wrong. Because we're not getting anywhere. Like, we go a long ways with lots of things. We're not getting anywhere with consciousness. Okay, so back to the archetype. So, because I can tell you how these things arise to some degree. So, you're interested in other people, say. And so, you're interested in them because they're unbelievably useful resources, right? Because they know things, they have resources that you want. Plus, you want even subtle things from them. You want their attention, you want to play with them, there's all sorts of things that you need and want from other people. So these social interactions are incredibly valuable and informative. But the information is interesting because part of what every single person is constantly broadcasting to every other person is how to behave. So now, if you meet someone and let's say you find them interesting, well, I can tell you that the more ideal they are, assuming you're not too warped, the more ideal they are, the more you're going to be interested in them. Because that actually is what defines ideal. Like, as you become ideal, you could say that is also the same as becoming high status. As you become ideal, then you're interesting to people. So that's interesting, because what that means is that you can read off people's interest to find out when you're deviating from the ideal. And they don't even know what the ideal is. The ideal is that to which their attention is inexorably drawn. And they're always telling you when you fall short of the ideal. Always. It's being broadcast at you all the time. And then your imagination back there is to try and figure out, just what is this ideal? Because your imagination is watching you in a Piagetian sense, noticing what you do, and then trying to figure out what that is. So you'll have fantasies about the ideal. That often happens in a romantic relationship, especially at the beginning of it. Because you project your idealization onto the person that you're romantically attracted to. That's the projection of an archetype. So Jung would say, the woman will project an animus onto the man. The animus is her conceptualization of what the ideal man is. It's unconscious, because it's rooted in fantasy. And the man will be in concordance with that projection in some areas. Those are the areas where she likes him, by the way. And will be discordant in other areas. And that's the areas where she constantly disappoints him as the relationship develops. So the projection is there in part to help the person understand who it is that they're dealing with, because when you meet someone, you have to assume something about them. It's the same as projection. You have to assume something about them, and if you find them fascinating, which is what happens if you fall in love, maybe it's because they smell good or they're symmetrical or something, you immediately assume that, well, those things really matter. You immediately assume that they embody the ideal. It's an oversimplification, but the oversimplification has a basis, and the basis is, if it's interesting to me, it must be close to the ideal. Well, yeah, except the person that you're going out with, attracted to, is warped and bent and flawed and twisted in, 300 ways, and you'll find that out soon enough, just as they will about you. And that often just blows the relationship into bits, because the person will say, well, she wasn't who I thought she was. It's like, well, whoever said she was who you thought she was? It's like, where did you get the misapprehension that she was going to be who you thought she was? God, what do you know? You're led around by your sense of smell and your ability to detect symmetry. It's like, that's not very sophisticated. So so the anima and the animus are two primary Jungian archetypes, and they're very complex, but that kind of gets at the surface. The ideal that I was describing, so people are broadcasting information to each other, which is, be ideal, be ideal, be ideal. It's like, be my ideal, obviously. But let's say if I took 1,000 ideals and then averaged them or extracted out the common ideal, the ideal that was common to all of them, that would be a savior figure. That's what a savior figure is. And then now and then someone comes along who acts quite a bit like that. And poof, you've got yourself a religion. So do not be thinking that these images that people fall around, like what bloodhounds on a trail. Do not be thinking that those things are like conscious cognitive constructs, like Marxism. They last like 50 years and they kill 100 million people, and then that's the end of that. A good religious system, man, that'll keep a culture going for like 3,000 years. And even at the end of it, it doesn't disappear. We know that the story of Horus and Osiris, for example, drove Egypt, like Catholicism drove Europe, for like 3,000 years. That's a long time. And then it turned into Christianity. So it's not like it disappeared. Actually, it sort of transmuted into Judaism and then turned into Christianity. So it's not like the ideas disappeared. They didn't disappear at all. And believe me, you're just as possessed by them as any ancient Egyptian. It's just that you're more fragmented and conflicted, because what your unconscious assumes and what your conscious mind assumes aren't the same thing. And so you're all at war with yourself. And that's partly what makes you attracted to like moronic ideologies, by which I mean any ideology, because they're all false idols and false gods, and they're shallow. They're shallow and deadly, and they ruin your life. They destroy your soul. So that's just a catastrophic response. And that's why it's so terrible to have that discordance between your instinctual being, your deep instinctual being, and your little fragile, half-witted conscious mind that sort of thinks it's in control. It's like, you're not in control of anything. Believe me. Best you can do is follow what's right. That's the best you can do. We even know this neurologically to some degree. Like, if you look at the hypothalamus, it's a little part of the brain. We'll talk about it quite a bit. It's sort of where the Freudian id resides, to the degree that it resides anywhere. It's this collection of nuclei that do things like make you hungry, or make you thirsty, or make you, sexually desirous, or make you defensively aggressive, or make you terrified of an intruder who threatens your dominant status. It's this little tiny part of your brain. It's hardly even there at all. It has massive projections coming up into the cortex. And then there's little tendrils going down to regulate it. And so basically, as long as everything is pretty much perfect, your conscious mind is in control. But as soon as things deviate from the path to any degree whatsoever, the really smart parts of your brain take over. And then you do what they tell you to do, or you suffer the consequences. So you see this with people who binge eat, for example. Or sometimes people develop a condition called polydipsia, which is often a consequence of hypothalamic damage attendant on a stroke. And they'll drink water till they die. You cannot stop them, because they're ragingly thirsty, like someone who's starving. And like, you can say, well, you've had enough water. It's like, no, that is not going to cut it. It's not going to cut it. You're not getting anywhere with that. And you see the same thing with people who have like obsessive compulsive disorder, something like that. When they're not in the grip of the disorder, they're perfectly normal. You get those people to touch something they don't want to touch. It's like they're not the same person the second they do that. And whatever they thought of themselves, the themselves that was supposed to be in control, that bloody thing is like, it's like a wagon with a child in it being towed behind an elephant. It's got no control at all. So you have to, one of the things that's terrifying about Jung is that there's no escaping the realization of the nature of the forces that are behind the puppets that we are. In Pinocchio, that's why Pinocchio is a puppet, right? Something's pulling his strings. He's a marionette. And the things that are pulling his strings, well, they might have his best interests in mind, but they might not too. And so that's what Pinocchio is about, actually. And it's also about how not to be a mannequin. Turns out that you have to go to the bottom of the ocean and find your father in a whale and then drown. That's how you stop from being a puppet. It's like, and you think, well, you don't believe that. And I would say, well, yes, you do. You went and watched the movie, and you enjoyed it. Not only that, you understood it, even though you don't have any idea what it's about. And also, on the face of it, it's absolutely absurd. It's like, it's not a puppet first, it's a drawing of a puppet. So that's weird, that's two levels of weird, and then like, what the hell's with the cricket? Where'd he come from? And what's his role, and why is he the conscience? And why does he get like activated by a fairy? And why is the fairy a star? It's like you're in there, like Cletus the slack-jawed yokel, watching the screen, captivated by it. And you walk out and you don't even notice that you're so peculiar that it's just beyond belief. You don't even notice that that's so peculiar.
It's like, what the hell are you doing in that theater? Watching this marionette follow a bug around to a whale. It's like you walk out, oh, that was so touching. Really, like really, people are really crazy, you know, and weird. Like we're like rhinoceroses or platypuses or ostriches or penguins. We're weird right to the core. And when you start to, the weirdness is so deep and so ancient that even starting to touch consciousness of that just rocks your boat. So, but one thing or another will rock your boat. So sometimes it's nice to choose what thing it is. And it prepares you for things too. So I'll tell you part of what Pinocchio means. Pinocchio is a marionette. Anybody can pull the strings. I mean, he's got a good heart, but what's that worth? Nothing. Virtually nothing. Because he's naive. You know, you can manipulate. It's the fox and the, what is it, that stupid cat that manipulate him, right? And basically, behind them, you'll see the devil, because that devil pops out quite quickly in Pinocchio. And he's the thing that's behind all the local manifestations of evil that are trying to pull Pinocchio's strings. And he gets blown off the right path pretty badly. Almost turns into an unconsciously braying donkey who ends up working in the slave mines, which is exactly what happens, by the way, you know, that's what happened to devout communists who found themselves swallowed up by Stalin's nightmare in the 1940s and the 1950s. It's like, well, we were so good. We did everything you wanted. It's like, yeah, well, it turned out what we wanted is for you to die painfully. So, you know, congratulations. So, you know, and that's brilliantly laid out in Pinocchio, which in fact was written in the 1930s. Brilliantly laid out. It's a way more intelligent analysis of the 1930s than anything you'll ever find that was written. So, Pinocchio, you know, he's trying to hew the proper path, and he learns that he shouldn't lie. That's a what do you call, archetypal idea. I can tell you why that is later. And it turns out that in order to get out of the horrible mess that he's put himself in, partly by being a slavish adherent to like momentary pleasure and nihilism, you know, he ends up half a jackass who can't speak properly without braying, so that makes him an ideologue. And the only way that he can get out of that is to go down to the bottom of the ocean, as deep as he can possibly go, deeper than anything is willing to go, to find his father. What's his father? His father is the culture that he lost touch with. You know, and to the degree that you guys are lost, like all human beings are lost, the reason you're lost is because you've never rescued your father from the bottom of the ocean. You haven't gone deep enough. You won't have even known it was necessary. It's necessary. You're a social, historical, cultural creature, right down to where you become a biological creature. And if that isn't part of you, and if that part isn't functioning properly, then you can just be blown off course by the wind. There's nothing to you. You're not grounded in anything. That's partly why the shaman, when they go down, communicate with their ancestors. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to pull up the cultural understructure of their societies up into consciousness to make use of it. And you constantly have to have a dialogue with that because, you know, say your background, just for the sake of argument, is Jewish. A lot of the lines of you know, the culture that you're embedded in was written down by people several thousand years ago. It's like, it's not easy to figure out what the hell those people were talking about or why it's relevant to you. So there has to be a dialogue continually going on between the present and the past so that you can bring the wisdom forward without losing what's in it. Because if you lose what's in it, it's like, you're just nowhere. You know, I see this all the time in my practice, you know. Often it happens to people who get divorced or who are living together and not married, which you think, well, you're free. It's like, you don't want to be that free. You know, you want to argue with your partner about every single thing for the rest of your life? Well, that's what you have to do if you don't let your culture guide you. It's like, there's no rules. Go ahead, make up all the rules. See how easy that is. Christ, that'll kill the average person in 10 years. It's just such a weight, and you only have one life. You know, you might as well let some tradition guide you so you have some peace some of the time. Or you'll end up divorced and with children. It's like, that's cancer for lots of people. They get divorced, they have children, they get locked into a custody battle, and they're done. That's the end of their life. They're ruined by it. So, you step outside of the guidelines of your culture at your own peril. And modern people, because they're so coddled, think, oh yeah, well, we can handle it. It's like, Sure, you can. You wait till you get there. You'll find out that you can't handle it. And it'll be too late. What'll have happened is that, the whale that you were supposed to go confront and rescue your father from has risen out of the water and taken you down. And you're done. That's chaos. So, these are serious issues. Like, Jung, I would say, was the most serious thinker of the 20th century. Like, he was so serious that the pseudo-serious people who read him just bounce off him. They don't even know what the hell he's up to. So Jung was one of those thinkers who was addressing questions that most people don't know exist, like at the bottom of reality, and who was also answering them. So he's a twofold blow to the intellect. First, he tells you that you're so stupid, you don't even know what's wrong. You can't even ask the right questions. And then he answers them. It's like, oh boy, yeah, that'll do in your intellectual pretensions. So, and the contrast between Dawkins, I think, and Jung is exactly the right contrast. It's the contrast between the intelligent modern Dawkins and the sort of historically centered wise man. And it's sort of painful for me to watch, because I've kind of watched Dawkins, and he's not a happy man, and he's got a tremendous resentment against the church. I'm sure something terrible must have happened to him when he was a child. But anyways, let me show you some of this stuff, because it's such fun. It's such fun. Didn't it sound fun? Not really. Okay, so I'm going to show you the opening of the Lion King. Oh, God. Yep. Yeah, good idea. Thanks. Yeah. Like, why not use a media player that works? Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to play for you is the opening scene. The opening scene is very nicely designed. It's the music I find a little bit manipulative. It's a little poppy, and it's manipulative. Like, it's an interesting example of how art can go wrong, because it's sort of art designed for a purpose, and art cannot be designed for a purpose. The purpose of art is art's purpose, not your purpose. And so if you're trying to bend the art to your purpose, it's like you're painting a picture of a stick man on a stained glass window. Like, you just haven't got the right orientation. Art is an exploratory process, and it's supposed to take you beyond what you know. If you take art and try to force it into your preconceptions, then you're a propagandist and an ideologue, and like you're bending the greater to the lesser. So, and that makes it feel cheap, and it doesn't fit well. And like, The Lion King's a pretty good movie, and I mean, from a psychological perspective, it devolves into propaganda from time to time. That happens now and then in Disney films, but it's still a work. It's a work of genius, which is why you will know it. This is where you get your religion. Okay, so that's an archetypal image. And they open with it, right? So it's the dawn of consciousness. So it's the new day, but it's also the dawn of consciousness. It's the dawn of consciousness because you're a visual creature. And it's also the dawn of consciousness because you wake up in the morning. So it's like sun, rise, light, dawn of consciousness. And then the music is a celebration of that. And you can feel it. It grips you right away. I mean, that part of the music is really, really nice. I think that's is that the gospel singers from South Africa? I think it is. The guys that played with Paul Simon, I think so. They're great. Okay, so what are all the animals doing all of a sudden? And they're waking up and they're paying attention to a call, right? And the call is musical. So then the question is, well, what's music? Well, music is a representation of like the dynamic patterns of things. And so you get all this complex information that's going on right off the bat. Consciousness dawns, and now there's a call. And everything that's sentient is to pay attention to the call. That's pretty good for like 5 seconds of film. So now there's, the filmmakers hit you with a whole succession of very beautiful images, and they do that with a very beautiful music that's underneath, and that's to put you like in a state of harmony with, well, not only with nature, but with your own conceptions of nature and your sense of aesthetics. It works quite nicely. It pops you into a dream very quickly. There's a lot going on there. So the lyrics are quite interesting because the lyrics are making representation to that state of being that I talked to you about, that William James had experienced, say, with his nitrous oxide visions, but that also that Piaget and the constructivists sort of think about as the ground of being. So, the lyricist made a case that what surrounds you is informative to a degree that you will never be able to comprehend it. And the implication under that is that, at least one of the ways of construing the ground of experiential being is as a information-rich matrix. And the music is pushing you in that direction too, because the music is a representation of what that information-rich matrix is like. Because it's patterned and complex, but understandable, and it also evokes emotion. So that's reality. And there's a lot of paradise imagery in here too, because it's sort of like all these animals they're all doing the same thing, and they're sort of existing in harmony. It's like this elephant's covered with birds, and so in a way it's a childish view of the world, because those elephants are covered with ticks, and the lions are half starved because it's been a drought, and it's not so good out there on the African plains. It's not all That'll teach me. Okay, so, but they're getting you in the mood. Now, the lyricist also made reference to the fact that there's a paradise, there's an element of Genesis in the lyricist, because she talks about our arrival on the earth, so to speak, and then the dawning of consciousness, which is this step into the sun. And so that's an archetypal motif. We're placed on earth, well, here we are after all, and poof, we woke up. And the reason that's an archetypal idea is because that's what happens to everybody. Right? Poof! You're placed on the earth. Bang! One day you wake up. It's the eternal experience of human beings, and there's something that's deeply real about it. It's the circle of life. Now that was cool. So we better watch that. We better watch that again. It's the circle of life. So that's a revelation, right? And so that's a very sneaky bit of the camera work. So, first of all, your vision is obscured, but then it's directed by the motion to this, like, place. What's that? Well, that's a good question. It's what? And just what exactly is Pride Rock? That's right. The rock is where the king is. That's right. That's the top of the pyramid. Now remember those trees I showed you from the shaman? It's so cool. I just figured this out the other day. Inside that tree there was a mountain, and the mountain was surrounded by a snake. You remember that? There's a circle with a snake around it. That's exactly the structure of this Lion King setup. You remember that? So you got the mountain in the middle there. What's on the outside? Hyenas, that's right. The chaos is out there where the light won't touch. Right? It's a perfect representation of the Scandinavian world tree. So cool. So okay, now, obviously, you and other animals are supposed to lift up your eyes, which is what the filmmaker made you do, and focus on this thing. It's a rock. What is a rock? What does a rock stand for?
Balance? Balance and like structure?
Yes, exactly. Why? Balance, it's structure. Why? Why is a rock a good metaphor for that?
Because it's a solid.
That's right. Rocks, they're strong. Even in an earthquake, if you're lucky, they won't liquefy. So you want to stand on a rock. Right. The question is, what kind of rock do you want to stand on? And that's exactly. Is it a physical rock? That's one way of looking at it. Or is there a metaphysical rock that's even a better rock? Well, that's partly what this film investigates. But at the moment, there's a rock. It's been there forever. And the king has been there forever. And the king is the thing at the top of the dominance hierarchy, which is why you lift up your eyes to it. And the king here is a lion. Why does that make sense? Lions aren't kings, after all. But it makes sense. Why? They're at the top of the food chain. Okay, so that's a good one. Any other possible reasons? Yes?
Maybe the mane sort of represents a regal authority.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, definitely. And the animators capitalize on that all the time. And they're kind of noble looking, because they're muscular. And plus they could eat you. Right, so that sort of indicates that there are certain circumstances under which you are at the bottom of the hierarchy, and the lion is in fact at the top. So, because a lion is also an awe-inspiring beast. Like, the shepherds in the Old Testament, around that time, a shepherd, you think, well, shepherd, he's dressed this little frilly hat, and, he's not much of a powerhouse at all. But those guys used to fight off lions. It's like, that's you got to be really tough to fight off a lion with a stick, So, yeah. So anyways, okay, so there's the rock, and the sun is shining on it, and what are the animals doing? Gathering around the rock. Now, we accept that as a narrative possibility, right? You're not sitting there thinking in the theater, what the hell are those animals doing, gathering around the rock? And the fact that you're not sitting there thinking that is an indication that you're following the archetypal trail of the story. It makes sense to you that a diverse bunch of drawings of animals would, come together around a rock. That makes sense. Why? Well, it has something to do with our dominance hierarchy proclivity and the fact that we can recognize an authority structure, and we know how to interact with it. And so these aren't animals, after all. They're people. Well, they're not, because they're drawings, but they're certainly not animals. They're not acting like animals. Or they're acting like half human, half animals. All right, now, who's that little guy? Okay, what's he good for? Information. Yes. Why? Why is he good for information? And so what? Why is that relevant? He can get up there, way the hell up there, where the king can't even see. And he can see everything. It's Horus's eye. That's exactly right. That's the Egyptian eye that says, pay attention. And so the bird is attention, fundamentally. So, and the king, by the bird, he's a little ratty bird, and he's kind of funny. I think he's that English comedian. So he's a bit of a comical character, but the king will listen to him. And so that shows that this king is a properly humble king, because it's just a stupid bird, and you could bite it in half in one bite. which is kind of what Scar threatens to do, because Scar doesn't want to pay attention, because then he'd figure out who he was. So, but the king, he'll pay attention to even, this is also why in fairy tales it's often the youngest son. The oldest son is usually the one who everyone likes and admires, and he's like the football quarterback, of the fairy tale. And the younger son is like, well, he's kind of a little weaselly, useless guy. And the older son always fails, and then usually the second son fails too. And it's usually because they're arrogant. And then the third son, he's so clueless he doesn't even know what to do. But they kick him out because they just as soon get rid of him. And why not let him go? You don't want him around anyways. And so he wanders out in the bush, and he comes across a gnome or something that it's like you just ignore it. The other brothers did, but he doesn't know what the hell he's doing. So the gnome talks to him, and he thinks, well, I might as well talk to this gnome, and then the gnome tells him what to do. And then the youngest son wins, and that's an archetypal story too. It's like, if you don't know what you're doing, don't be so sure that you know who to ignore. Now that's a very, very useful piece of advice. But then you might ask yourself, how do you know when you don't know what you're doing? So do you have any thoughts on that? How is it that you would know if you didn't know what you were doing?
You're consistently failing?
Yes, but that's very good. That's very good. But there's one more thing that goes along with that, and I'll just add it because it's a bit of a trick in some sense. And it's bothering you, right? So there's failure plus suffering. Now, one of the inferences that you can draw from failure plus suffering is that nature is your enemy, and you're a victim of the Great Father. It's like very standard presupposition, especially of young people, because of course you're failing, you're young. It's like, what the hell do you know? You've got a whole bunch of things to learn yet before you can be successful. But, that's an archetypal situation in large part. Okay, so... Great. So now we see the king. So what do we notice about the king? He's kind of a tough-looking guy. He's not one of these defeated lobster types of lion kings. He's like an upstanding, sort of confident. Okay. And so he was also in the sun, right? So the sun shines on the king, and that's because the king is awake. And the sun also illuminates him. You may not know this, but you've seen coins, of course. Silver coin, that's the moon. The head of the queen is the head of the queen on the moon. And gold coins are the sun, and so are halos. And the idea is that the thing that's at the top is like the sun. And why is it like the sun? Well, because the sun is consciousness. And why is the sun consciousness? Because you're awake during the day. Now, there's a bunch of other reasons as well. The sun is also the thing that defeats darkness, and that's what the king should be. And that's right in her coins. And they're symbols of value. So and the wind is blowing on it. It's not bothering him, by the way, but that's a divine wind. That's pneuma. Pneuma, that's spirit, because spirit is often wind, as in inspiration and respiration. That's all spirit. So, spirited king, here comes the bird. It's not lunch, it's his friend. Now, who in the world is that? That's Carl Jung. Yeah. Who's that? Well, that's the Virgin Mary and Christ. That's the Virgin and the Son. It's a way older idea than the Christian idea. It's been around forever. Why? Because any culture that doesn't worship the mother and child dies. Obviously. So it's an archetypal image of value. Clearly, obviously. You don't have to think about that much. So... Oh yeah, that's famous. I love that. It always happens, eh? There's two things always happen when I show this, always, because it evokes archetypal emotions. So you are all making, oh, isn't that cute noises, right? What kind of noises are those? Yeah, it's oh. So babies like that noise. That's why you're making that noise. It's like, the baby will like that noise. They'll smile at you, and then you'll think that the baby likes you, even though it's just a survival mechanism. It is, but the baby actually likes you. So why is that cute? First of all, it's not real. You might notice that. It's a drawing. Why is it cute? What makes it cute? Big eyes, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, that's part of it. Aliens have big eyes too, though. What else? It's cuddly, yeah. So it's mammalian. That's how. It's not a lizard, So that's helpful. It's got fur, so you can pet it. Sort of invites being petted, and it moves like this. It's like, that's so cute. That little polar bear. I've been watching a little bit of that. It's like, that's like pathologically cute, that thing. And it's, part of it is it's sort of wobbling around. And it's like the poor thing, it's trying to walk. It's having a rough time, and everybody thinks, oh, that's so cute. It's like, if that was happening to you, you wouldn't think it was cute. But animals across a diverse range of mammalian species know cute, And they tend to respond to, like, big-eyed, symmetrical, small-nosed, flat-faced, helpless movement, cuddly, and not eat it, right? So it's an inhibitory, it's a set of inhibitory perceptual mechanisms in large part. But since we're also mammals, you better think that thing's cute, because you're going to be taking care of it for a long time. So, there has to be a deep biological connection that's forged almost immediately, and of course that's mediated in women, in particular by oxytocin, which is released in tremendous quantities after birth and during breastfeeding. And it's necessary, it turns on new circuits, and they're circuits you need, because like one day you're not a mother, and then the next day you are. You are not the same creature at that point. And you don't want to even be the same creature. You're pretty happy about the whole issue, hopefully. So that's a very interesting image, because first of all, he was playing with the little Lion King with those balls, and there's this sort of globe thing that's attracting him. So they're like representations of the sun, and you might think, well, you're just reading that into it, but then of course this happens. It's like this is like he's breaking open the sun to release the essence of the sun onto the little Lion King. And he is, because the sun represents gold. Gold is pure, right? Gold won't mix with any other metal, so that's partly why it's a symbol of value. It's a noble metal. The sun is made out of gold, so to speak, except it's like meta-gold from a symbolic perspective, because it's like the gold of higher consciousness. And it's being dumped on the little Lion King because, for the tribe's sake, and then maybe even for the sake of the whole ecosystem around the tribe, that king better be awake. So that's what this like little Carl Jung baboon here is trying to get going. Okay, so now you notice two things. Lovely, this is a lovely, very well put together scene. It's very thoughtful. So the animals are starting to lift up their heads, so you get the sense of heightened interest. And the music is starting to rise a little bit and speed up in tempo a little bit. And you know something's going to happen here that's associated with the little pinnacle of the rock there. Brilliant. No, so well edited. So this little thing that now represents what will become the guiding consciousness of the land is revealed. And the automatic response of all the animals is first to bow, so they're in awe, as they should be, and then to celebrate. And then that's, that's pretty good. It's pretty impressive. But then, God himself gets in the act, because just at the opportune time, the sun breaks and shines on the little lion. At the same time, they move the music up, like they change the key of the music. And so it causes an upswelling of emotion. And that's, Jung would call that, if and when that happened, that's what he would call a synchronous event. So that's a demonstration of a synchronous event. It's where they're very rare, these things. They're, from a Jungian perspective, they occur in very emotionally intense situations where the context, the external context of the occurrence seems to match the meaning of the occurrence. So, anyways, whether or not you believe such things are possible, that is exactly what this little film clip is trying. All right, so you've got the animals, you've got the stone hierarchy that's a pyramid, you've got the thing that's at the top of it, just like the little pyramid on the back of the American dollar bill with the eye on top. Exactly the same idea. And part of the idea is that the thing that's at the very top of the pyramid isn't part of the pyramid. So it's not stone. The little Lion King, he isn't stone. He's the thing that produces stone as he moves through time, right? Because he's the culture-producing force. And so this is set up to demonstrate visually that at the center of being is culture. At the top of culture is the culture-producing process or force. And that's the illuminated Savior. And that's what all the animals worship instinctively. It's like, yes, that's right. That's how it goes. We'll see you on Tuesday.